short time ago, I ordered the United States Armed Forces to launch precision strikes on targets associated with the chemical weapons capabilities of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad. A combined operation with the armed forces of France and the United Kingdom.
I have authorised British armed forces to conduct coordinated and targeted strikes to degrade the Syrian regime's chemical weapons capability and deter their use. This is not about intervening in a civil war. It is not about regime change.
French President Emmanuel Macron also confirmed his country's participation in the operation. The joint strikes are in response to last week's alleged chemical attack on the Syrian town of Douma, which killed at least 60 people. Washington pointed the finger at President Bashar al-Assad's government, but Damascus denied the accusations, saying the attack was the work of terrorists. Syria's ally Russia had earlier warned that Western military strikes would risk starting a war. Trump on Friday emphasized that the purpose of this strike was to establish a strong deterrent against the production, spread and use of chemical weapons. Syrian state television confirms strikes on the capital city, and the country's air defenses have been deployed. The ongoing tension in the region, which already suffered from 7 years of war, seems to be escalating once more. Natasha Hussein, CGTN.
Well, Russian President Vladimir Putin has condemned the strikes as an act of aggression. He's called an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council. Russia has also warned that there will be consequences following the precision strikes. Now, Iran has also condemned the strikes as a blatant violation of international laws. Russia's defense ministry is expected to make a statement on Moscow's stance. The ministry says most of the incoming missiles were shot down by Syrian defense systems. Russian bases in Syria have not been targeted. Russia's foreign ministry says Syria has been attacked just as it had a chance for peace. Well, let's get you more reactions now on those strikes. I'm joined live from Moscow by our correspondent, Julia Lyubova. Julia, can you tell us more about Russia's response to the strikes on Syria?
Well, Russia has strongly condemned the airstrikes on Syria. We've been hearing from a variety of Russian officials, and Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, who hasn't commented until now on this, he said that Russia strongly condemns what he called the attack on Syria, where Russian servicemen are helping legitimate government, he said, to fight terrorism. Vladimir Putin also said that Moscow is now calling for a UN Security Council emergency meeting to discuss what he called aggressive actions by the United States and allies. And Putin also said that the United States' actions made the humanitarian catastrophe worse in Syria and caused pain to civilians, and as well as damaging international relations. So indeed, a strong condemnation coming from Moscow.
And indeed, we've heard Russia saying that there will be consequences. Russia has not necessarily ruled out war when it comes to US actions in Syria. How concerned should we be at this stage?
Yes, indeed. Russia has warned of consequences, and we heard from the Russian ambassador to the United States, who said that these airstrikes will not go without an answer. They haven't given out any details of what these consequences will be yet, so we will have to wait and see. But Russian Defense Ministry has confirmed that no Russian military objects were hit or targeted, and as far as we know, that no Russian servicemen were killed in these airstrikes. And of course, if this was the case, then Russia's response would have been a lot stronger than what it is now. And then, so we'll just have to wait and see exactly what actions Russia will take. But for now, it's just asking for the United Nations Security Council to convene for an emergency meeting.
And of course, there is also the question of whether or not that response will involve Syria. How likely is it that the two countries, Russia and Syria, will coordinate their response and their action going forward?
Well, indeed, Russia is Syrian government's biggest ally and has been supporting Bashar al-Assad throughout this conflict. Of course, Russia has been helping Bashar al-Assad militarily since September 2015. It's not exactly clear just how they will coordinate, but they probably will be taking some joint actions. We've already heard from the Russian Defense Ministry, who said that Russia may consider supplying S-300 missile systems to Syria. And indeed, the two countries could consider working further on some kind of missile defense system as well in the future.
Julia Lyubova, thank you so much for bringing us that response there from Russia, joining us live from Moscow. And as she says there, most likely a coordinated response expected from Russia and Syria. Well, let's take a look now at the US and Russian military deployment in Syria. The Pentagon said in December that 2,000 US troops were in Syria, but that figure does not include an unknown number of special forces. Officially, they're there to help local militias drive out ISIL militants. Russia joined the war in Syria in 2015 at a time when ISIL and other insurgents appeared to threaten President Bashar al-Assad's government. The number of Russian troops in Syria is unknown, and the Air Force is the mainstay of Moscow's campaign in the country. Well, meanwhile, China's permanent representative at the UN has called for all parties concerned to remain calm and exercise restraint over the situation in Syria. Ma Jiazhou made the comments on Friday. During the Security Council meeting on Syria, Ma said, "We call on all parties to remain calm, exercise restraint, refrain from any move that may lead to further escalation of the situation, solve the issue peacefully through consultation and dialogue." Well, let's get to more on those strikes and the reactions from around the world. We start in Egypt. CGTN's Adel Al-Mahroui joins us live now from Cairo. Adel, let's start with the Arab League. Has there been any official response yet to the strikes in Syria from this regional organization?
Yet. The Arab League has not announced any official statement yet. Now we know that all the Arab League officials are currently in Saudi Arabia in the city of Dammam in preparations for the Arab Summit, an annual scheduled meeting between Arab leaders of the 22 state members at the Arab League. The Pan-Arab Organization itself did not comment on the attacks yet. However, there are some points to clarify. Syria has a frozen member at the Arab League, so there is no representation for the Syrian government or the Syrian country in general inside the Arab League. This has been the situation since the emergence of the Syrian crisis years ago. But in terms of reaction from Arab countries, Saudi Arabia has supported the attacks. It says that President Bashar al-Assad has brought these attacks to his country by using chemical weapons. Egypt, on the other hand, has warned about the gravity of escalation using force in Syria. Egypt stresses that there must be international efforts to maintain peace and to reach a solution based on the desires of the Syrian people. Egypt said that it is against the use of any forbidden weapons forbidden by the international law, and it calls for a clear and a transparent investigation before reaching any conclusions. So Egypt wants to see an investigation on the ground in Syria to verify whether chemical weapons have been used or not. Iraq has called for an emergency Arab summit. It wants to use the opportunity that Arab leaders are already on their way to Saudi Arabia to hold a separate session, an emergency session only on Syria. Iraq has been known to be a supporter also for the Syrian government. That's the main three countries who have given immediate responses, and we're still waiting for more, but all during the early morning we did not see any immediate reaction from the Arab world. These latest reactions I've just mentioned have just came in the past few minutes.
And what's the sense among Egyptians? Do they think Syria's government was really responsible for that chemical attack last weekend? And how concerned are they over this situation?
Talking on a popular level, Egyptians in general always stand on a firm position when it comes to attacking any other country, particularly when it sees the West attacking countries. It reminds them of what happened in Iraq. And because of that, many are critical about the Western reports about having, about Syrian government using chemical weapons. It reminds them exactly of what happened in Iraq in 2001 when there were reports saying that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. And after the US war on Iraq, we discovered that these reports were not accurate. So this is a repetition, more or less. It reminds the Egyptian nation in general about what happened before and to what extent should we trust the Western reports. But that's mainly why the Egyptian government is calling for a transparent investigation first before reaching any conclusion.
Adel Al-Makhroui from that, giving us that reaction there from Egypt. Thanks very much for joining us live from Cairo. Well, in the meantime, Australia has welcomed the US-led airstrikes against Syrian regime chemical attacks. Although Australian forces played no part in the joint strikes, Defence Minister Marise Payne said Australia was in full support of the action.
The use of chemical weapons by anyone, anywhere, under any circumstances is illegal and reprehensible. The Assad regime cannot be allowed to commit such crimes with impunity. That is why Australia fully supports the US-led strikes against chemical weapons facilities in Syria today. The strike by the United States, France and the United Kingdom forces targeted the Syrian regime's chemical weapons research, development and production capability. Those locations were specifically chosen to minimise the risk to civilians. This morning I've spoken with the United States Secretary for Defence, Jim Mattis, who has briefed me on the strikes.
Now, American lawmakers and Russian politicians have taken to Twitter following the strikes, and there are mixed reactions from praise to condemnation. CGTN's Susan Mwongeli takes us through some of them.
The US airstrikes against Syria's chemical weapon facilities has elicited strong reactions. Leading Republicans from the Senate and the House of Representatives have lent their support. Republican Senator for South Carolina, Lindsey Graham, described President Assad as a legitimate military target. Republican Senator John McCain applauded the strikes and called for a comprehensive strategy for Syria. But some leading Democrats questioned the legality of the US strikes. They said only Congress has the constitutional responsibility for, quote-unquote, making war. Russia's ambassador to the United States has also reacted. He reiterated that there would be consequences for the US-led military strikes on Syria. Susan Mwongeli, CGTN.
And indeed, people across Africa are closely watching these developments out of Syria. Let's get you more on that now. I'm joined live on the line from Addis Ababa by CGTN's Gurum Chala. Gurum, first of all, has the African Union released a statement yet on these latest strikes in Syria?
So far there's no official statement, but I have tried to communicate the African Union officials about the matter. And they have disclosed a few points, if I may explain what they are. First of all, it's a shocker to hear that there are yet another round of airstrikes in the already devastated Syria. The African Union officials are necessarily shocked about it. They said the African Union's position on the use of chemical weapons is clear, and it's against international law in the first place, that is, in our common humanity. Any use of such weapons, this is to refer to what happened earlier in Syria before the airstrikes, which the U.S. is using as a reason to do these things, said anywhere, anytime, this use of chemical weapons are not acceptable. The African Union's position when it comes to this current airstrikes, I spoke to the spokesperson of the Commission itself, Eba Kalondo. She said the African Union Commission does not support any military action in Syria, a country that has already suffered far too long from this kind of conflict. She also said military action only exacerbates the already explosive political context in the region and expose Syrians to further and unacceptable levels of suffering. So the African Union came out, or the officials that came out very strongly about what is happening in Syria at the moment.
And as you say, the AU does not support military action in Syria. How concerned then is the organization at this stage about this escalation in Syria?
Well, obviously the AU does not really have a say directly to what's happening in that part of the world, but as a citizen of the world and also a key organization in our world, and especially in this continent, and they just don't want to see this being solved, as I said earlier, through arms. And so far what we've seen of airstrikes in Libya, for example, Africa is a living testimony of how devastating war and strikes this level. For example, the U.S.-led airstrikes in Libya has destroyed the country and cannot come out of the woods anytime soon, as you understand. So the African Union always supports dialogue around the table to solve the existing problem in Syria. But at the moment, as I was also saying earlier, what is being seen, this U.S.-led airstrikes, they're only causing death, more destruction, and perhaps complicate further the situation in that region as well. So the AU is not really keen on even seeing what is we are seeing at the moment since morning.
Thank you so much, Girum Chala, bringing us the reaction there from the African Union, joining us from Addis Ababa. Meanwhile, ordinary Americans have also been reacting to the news of strikes in Syria, and there too are also mixed reactions in the United States.
Yeah, I'd hope that there's a longer plan in place than just a reactionary response. Obviously something has to be done if they're poisoning their own countrymen and women, but hopefully it doesn't just start as a response and then figure out what to happen after we bomb.
I just don't think that the conflict with the U.S. today is bringing any benefit, because we already have unstable presidency, homelessness, unemployment, and we have so many other problems that I feel like with Syria, with Iran, with the Middle East, it's a continual thing. The last 10 years, I feel like maybe peace is a better option.
Yeah, of course not. I mean, we have already enough problems in the world, and then yeah, let's just go and start a war. Like, no, probably not the best decision. Like, no.
Well, earlier we spoke to Edmund Garib, a scholar and specialist in media issues and Middle East affairs. He spoke to us about the limited and targeted strike on Syria.
It seems now that while the Hawks may have won by launching an attack, that General Mattis and General Dunford appear to have, however, put some restraints, and we have a limited kind of attack, because the targets, at least so far, about what we know up to this point, the targets were a research facility for chemical and other weapons, or allegedly that's what they are. Also allegedly storage facilities in 2 different places of chemical and maybe biological weapons. This is limited. What we heard is that the number of missiles that were launched was double the number of missiles that were launched last year. So there were maybe about something like 120, 130 missiles, the number would be. So basically this is somewhere between the large-scale attacks and the more limited. It appears to be, up till now, a much more limited kind of attack, which basically is saying that they didn't want to see a confrontation, a major confrontation with the Russians or the Iranians.
Well, indeed, a cause for concern across the world. Let's get you more perspective on the situation in Syria. I'm joined live in studio by Dr. Francis Onditi, a senior lecturer in international relations and diplomacy at Riara University in Kenya. Doctor, of course, we've seen Syria, Russia, Iran strongly condemn these US-led attacks. Russia already warning of consequences. How worried should we be that this could escalate into a war?
Yeah, I would say the world is experiencing what you could call a unipolar Cold War, because we are seeing a divided, world, and quite a lot of military activities. With the strike, we should expect nothing less than escalation, either in terms of more bombardment in Syria, But the challenge is how the joint strikes, I mean the France, US and Britain, how they're going to calculate so that at the end of it we minimize collateral damage. The escalation might also get to other, other spaces in terms of how much resources the world is going to commit to that, the investment. So is actually a war economy that the world is being forced into. Something that happened some decades back. Yeah.
And when you say that this military activity in a divided world is something that could escalate to other spaces, how concerned should Africa be?
We should be concerned because already the entire Middle East is full of military activities, as I said. And, the people who are involved in conflict in Syria it's not a conventional war. There is quite a lot of asymmetrical war. We've got groups of non-conventional who are involved in the military. Now, if America and its allies decided to neutralize that, the question is, where are these groups going to? The Yemen and the other regions. So militant activities, extremist, even radicalization of these groups, or rather where they will be going to, we are also likely to experience extremist activities or maybe kind of military attacks that are not conventional. So obviously Africa is involved, one, in terms of political economy, commitment of resources, prices of commodities like oil is likely to escalate, and also involvement of diplomacy, which would obviously require commitment from the African countries. Yeah.
And Doctor, it's sometimes hard to believe that what started as anti-government protests in 2011 against President Bashar al-Assad has escalated to what we're seeing today, these US-led strikes on Syria. Could this escalation have been prevented?
Yeah, it could have been prevented, obviously, but I think there are two major issues that the world is grappling with. For example, even though we know in 2013 there was a United Nations resolution, security resolution 2118, which actually strengthened the prohibition of production and use of chemical weapons. We've seen these activities going on. We've seen Syria doing this quite a lot. But then the powers, the members of the Security Council seem to be deeply divided on whether President Assad is doing the right thing or not. Russia, on the other side, believe that perhaps we need to give sovereignty to that country, Syria. On the other side, the US with allies, they feel like, okay, it is the high time that we need to use military methods of resolving this. And therefore, you don't have a situation where all the powers, the members of the Security Council agree. They disagree, and the disagreement is actually what has led to this bombardment. It was the last resort, but they are covered within the law, the international law, that in circumstances when we believe there is a facility in Syria which is producing chemicals that are going to be used against civilians.
But quite interestingly, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons hasn't concluded an investigation into Saturday's attack, and now these strikes have already taken place, preempting it somewhat.
Yeah, they will continue with the investigation, but I think the preliminary findings and investigations show that surely chemical weapons have been used. Don't forget 2 years back, the same thing happened. I think we had proof beyond any reasonable doubt that chemical weapons were used. And
we'll have to leave it there, Dr. Onditi. Thank you so much for that analysis, joining us here live in our studio in Nairobi.